The winter air of 1944 hung heavy over the docks of New York Harbor. A gray transport ship, streaked with salt and diesel soot, eased toward Pier 88. On its deck stood hundreds of men in faded Feldgrau uniforms. German soldiers, silent, gaunt, their eyes following the slow movement of the cranes. For weeks, they had crossed the Atlantic under armed guard, the steel hull echoing with engines and fear. They had expected cold faces and rough hands when they reached America. The land they had been told was ruled by brutality and greed. But as the gangway was lowered and the prisoners marched onto American soil, something strange happened. The guards didn't shout. No rifle butts struck their backs. Instead, U.S. soldiers guided them quietly toward a long wooden table where steam rose from tin trays, soup, bread, hot coffee. The Germans hesitated, uncertain if it was a trick. Then they saw it. The American guards stepped aside and gestured for them to eat first. For the first time since capture, the prisoners looked at one another not as soldiers, but as men, bewildered, silent, and deeply human. That moment was when many realized America was not what they had been told. In early 1943, the deserts of North Africa had become a graveyard of broken armor and buried ambitions. The German Afrika Korps, once hailed as the unstoppable spear of the Reich under Erwin Rommel, was running out of everything that made war possible: fuel, ammunition, and faith. Allied air power had closed the skies. British and American columns were converging from east and west, and the once proud divisions of the Wehrmacht were being squeezed into a shrinking pocket around Tunisia. By May, the Desert Campaign was over. Nearly 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, the largest mass capitulation of German forces up to that point in the war. Among them were veterans of Tobruk, El Alamein, and Kasserine Pass. They were disciplined men, many still loyal to their oath to Hitler, yet suddenly adrift in defeat. The Allies faced an immediate problem: what to do with such vast numbers of prisoners? Britain, already straining under nightly air raids and food shortages, could not house them all. The newly arrived American Expeditionary Forces, flush with manpower and resources, offered a solution. The United States possessed the one thing Europe could no longer afford: space. By mid-1943, plans were set in motion to transport tens of thousands of German POWs across the Atlantic. Under the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention, they were to be treated humanely, given rations equivalent to U.S. soldiers, and protected from reprisals. It was both a moral commitment and a logistical gamble. The first transports departed from Oran, Algiers, and Liverpool, long gray troop ships now carrying their former enemies in reverse. Inside, the prisoners were stunned by what they saw: orderly meals, medical inspections, even access to Red Cross parcels. For many, it was the first crack in the propaganda that had painted the Allies as savage conquerors. When the ships docked at ports like Norfolk, New York, and Boston, the American public barely knew what to expect. Newspapers carried small notices: Axis prisoners arrive under guard for internment. But there was little fanfare. The government kept the transfers discreet, partly to prevent public anger, partly to maintain security. The War Department, under General George C. Marshall, directed the creation of hundreds of POW camps across the continental United States, from the pine forests of Alabama to the plains of Kansas and the deserts of Arizona. They were designed to hold men who, only months earlier, had fought to destroy the same nation now housing them. Yet the Americans saw in this moment an opportunity, not just to detain, but to demonstrate. Unlike the Nazi system of forced labor and brutality, the U.S. military intended to uphold international law with precision. Every camp was to be inspected, every prisoner accounted for, every meal weighed against Army standards. The intention was clear: to prove, both to the world and to themselves, that democracy could remain moral even in total war. For the prisoners, the journey was a quiet unraveling of everything they thought they knew. The Atlantic crossing was long but not cruel. Guards offered cigarettes, water, even conversation. The men still marched in formation, saluting officers out of habit. But the edges of fear began to soften. When they first saw the American coastline, a faint gray line through the morning mist, many could not reconcile it with the stories told by Nazi radio, a nation of chaos and decadence. What awaited them was not vengeance, but order. And on those docks, when rations were handed out and the prisoners were served before the guards themselves, the realization began to settle. This was a different kind of enemy. The humane treatment of these prisoners was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate policy, born of pragmatism as much as principle. The War Department knew that word would spread. Through letters, through returning POWs, through whispers in the camps. And those whispers, in time, might erode the myths of the Reich far more effectively than bullets ever could. As the months unfolded, trains began to roll inland, guarded, silent, and steady, carrying thousands of German soldiers deep into the American heartland. Each mile took them farther from the war they had known and closer to a quiet confrontation with something far more disarming than firepower: mercy. The German prisoners were scattered across a nation at war. By late 1944, more than 400,000 Axis POWs, the vast majority German, were confined in over 500 camps stretching from Maine to California. Some were massive compounds that held thousands. Others were satellite sites built near farms, lumber mills, or canneries. Each camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by watchtowers, yet many looked more like small towns than prisons. Wooden barracks, open fields, and neat rows of mess halls reflected an industrial precision that mirrored the American way of war. Efficient, organized, and rule-bound. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to shelter, medical care, and food equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the U.S. troops guarding them. And so it was. Each man received 3 meals a day, meat when available, bread, potatoes, and coffee. The same coffee American soldiers drank at the front. At first, this equality unsettled them. They had been told that surrender to the Allies meant degradation. Instead, they found order and restraint. The U.S. military police were instructed not to humiliate or harm their captives. "You will treat them firmly, but fairly," read one War Department directive. Discipline was absolute, but cruelty was forbidden. It was not mercy out of sentiment. It was policy, rooted in America's desire to demonstrate moral authority in contrast to Nazi barbarism. Work was part of the system. Under Geneva rules, non-commissioned prisoners could be assigned labor not directly related to the war effort. Across the South and Midwest, German soldiers harvested cotton, chopped timber, built roads, and canned fruit, earning 80 cents a day in coupons redeemable at camp stores. Officers, forbidden from manual labor, spent their days teaching, debating, and writing journals that recorded their shock at the decency of their captors. Some camps offered educational programs organized by the U.S. Army Special Services. Prisoners could study English, mathematics, or even American history. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, a library stocked with German classics became a gathering place where defeated men tried to understand the culture that had conquered them. For guards and civilians alike, this strange coexistence created moments of uneasy humanity. Farmers who had lost sons in France now supervised German work details in their fields. Townspeople, at first wary, began to see that these men, once portrayed as monsters, were young, polite, and frightened. In some rural towns, POWs played soccer matches against American soldiers. The games drew crowds, laughter, and fleeting normalcy. War Department photographers captured these moments. German prisoners running across dusty fields under the same sun as their guards. But beneath the surface calm, the psychological struggle deepened. Many prisoners felt a growing unease that went beyond captivity. Everything around them, the abundance of food, the cleanliness of the barracks, the quiet discipline, contradicted the propaganda they had absorbed for years. Letters home were censored, but revealing. One POW wrote to his wife in 1944, "We are treated better here than in our own army." Another confessed, "It is strange to see that the Americans we fought are not devils, but men." Inside the camps, ideological divisions emerged. Hardline Nazis tried to maintain control, punishing those they saw as traitors of thought. But over time, isolation, comfort, and exposure to American order eroded their grip. The camps themselves became microcosms of Germany's future, a society forced to confront what it had believed. For the U.S., the system worked better than expected. Escapes were rare. Violence was minimal. The humane treatment had an unexpected strategic effect: cooperation. Prisoners worked willingly, followed rules, and, in many cases, began to feel a strange gratitude. By 1945, the camps were fully integrated into the American landscape. Quiet, self-contained worlds where the defeated enemy lived among their conquerors without hate. The contrast was astonishing. In Europe, cities burned under Allied bombs. In America, their former soldiers planted crops, learned English, and sat beneath maple trees reading Goethe. And through it all, one question haunted them: why would a victorious enemy choose kindness over vengeance? That question, born from that first meal on the dock, would become the turning point of their captivity, and the seed of a moral awakening that no propaganda could erase. The first days in captivity were marked not by violence, but by silence. In camp after camp, from Texas to Pennsylvania, the same pattern unfolded. Rows of German soldiers standing at attention before American sergeants reading regulations aloud in slow, deliberate English. The men listened, not understanding every word, yet sensing a strange absence: no shouting, no slaps, no humiliation. For many, that silence was louder than any command. The human adjustment began in the smallest of details: clean bedding, hot showers, and the smell of real food. Most had eaten little more than thin soup and hard bread in the final months of fighting. Now, they received plates of meat, vegetables, and coffee. The same rations issued to American soldiers. It felt wrong to some, even shameful. One corporal from the 10th Panzer Division later wrote, "I could not eat. I looked at the guard's plate. It was the same. We were enemies, yet we were equal. It was unbearable." Others felt quiet relief. Captivity, while humiliating, was also survival. Letters from German POWs reveal a tone of disbelief. They were being fed, not starved; given medical care, not abandoned. For soldiers who had been told that capture by the Allies meant torture or execution, this kindness created deep confusion. Psychologists within the U.S. Army observed it carefully. They noted that humane treatment didn't just maintain order, it broke ideological barriers. Each act of fairness forced the prisoners to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught. Among the guards, humanity existed in quiet gestures. American MPs often came from small towns: farm boys, students, and factory workers who had never left their states before the war. They followed orders precisely, but some went further, sharing cigarettes, trading songs, or teaching English phrases. An officer at Camp Swift, Texas, wrote in his journal, "We do not fraternize, yet somehow we understand one another. When they work the fields, they wave to the locals. Children wave back." These fleeting interactions built a bridge across the unlikeliest divide. The cultural encounters were equally striking. German prisoners brought with them a disciplined, formal worldview shaped by hierarchy and nationalism. America, to them, was a paradox: a land of both military order and personal freedom. In the camps, they witnessed democracy at work, even in small things. A guard questioning an officer's decision, or a civilian farmer complaining openly about government policy. One POW later recalled, "In Germany, to criticize was betrayal. In America, it was normal conversation. On nearby farms, where POWs were often sent for labor, relationships grew complex. American farmers, desperate for workers as young men went overseas, quickly realized that the Germans were skilled, punctual, and polite. Many treated them with cautious respect, some, eventually, with friendship. Meals shared in barns, simple handshakes, even Christmas greetings, all carried a quiet power. A farmer's wife in Nebraska told a local paper in 1945, "They were boys, just boys in the wrong uniform." To the prisoners, such kindness was both comforting and disturbing. How could the enemy they had been told to hate treat them better than their own leaders had treated conquered peoples? In time, the guards noticed changes. The rigid salutes softened. The loud Heil Hitler greetings faded. Some POWs began addressing officers by rank only, no longer with the same reverence. Others requested American books, curious to understand the society that had defeated them not only in battle, but in spirit. This gradual transformation was not universal. There remained fanatics, men who clung to Nazi ideology, who scrawled swastikas on barrack walls, and tried to enforce discipline through intimidation. But their influence weakened as months passed. The human experience of fair treatment proved more persuasive than any ideology. Cultural friction still existed. Some Americans resented seeing their sons' killers treated so well. There were protests in a few towns, newspaper editorials questioning the generosity. Yet military command stood firm. The U.S. Army insisted that adherence to the Geneva Convention was not charity. It was a statement of principle, and quietly, that principle began to reshape the minds of those who had once believed in absolute obedience. For many prisoners, the turning point came not in grand speeches, but in moments of ordinariness. An American medic dressing a wound, a cook offering extra bread, a child handing a Christmas card through a fence. These moments lingered. Years later, in interviews, former POWs would recall them with the same astonishment they had felt that first day on the dock. One phrase recurred again and again. "We could not understand why they were so kind." Behind every fence, between every guard tower, the human and cultural encounters slowly dissolved the illusion of the enemy. And with each passing day, the prisoners realized that captivity in America was not the end of their war. It was the beginning of an inner reckoning. Behind every plate of food served to a German prisoner stood an idea, not of mercy, but of control. The humane treatment of POWs in the United States was not simply a reflection of moral virtue, it was a calculated decision shaped by military leadership, international law, and long-term strategy. General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, understood that how America treated its prisoners would echo far beyond its borders. The war was not only a clash of armies, it was a battle for moral legitimacy. Every American camp, every inspection report, every recorded testimony became part of that campaign. To the War Department, the Geneva Convention was not a constraint, but a weapon. By following it rigorously, the United States could demonstrate its superiority, not only in strength but in character. Propaganda, in this case, did not require posters or broadcasts. It lived in the experiences of the men behind barbed wire. If a captured German soldier returned home after the war and spoke of decent food, fair guards, and humane treatment, that testimony would undermine years of Nazi indoctrination far more effectively than any Allied leaflet dropped over Berlin. The logic was simple and ruthless. Respect could serve strategy. Commanders across the American heartland understood this dual purpose. Camp regulations were strict. Officers received training on international law, and military police were drilled to maintain discipline without degradation. There was no tolerance for cruelty. Every infraction risked diplomatic protest or domestic scandal, and the Army could not afford either. Colonel Arthur Lobdell, who oversaw several POW installations in the Midwest, summarized it in one report. "We treat them as men, not because they deserve it, but because we must show that democracy has nothing to fear from decency." This principle became a doctrine, one that shaped every interaction within the camps. Even so, the leadership understood the psychological leverage at play. The Germans were a disciplined people, conditioned to hierarchy and order. When they encountered the same structure, but rooted in fairness rather than fear, it confused them. The system held authority without cruelty, command without fanaticism. For many, this was their first exposure to the concept of freedom bounded by law, a democracy that could command respect through justice rather than terror. American intelligence took careful note of this transformation. The Office of War Information, OWI, and the Military Intelligence Division collected thousands of POW statements, analyzing how their attitudes shifted over time. Some prisoners expressed admiration for the American system. Others expressed shame that they had believed in Nazi lies. By 1945, the War Department recognized that these men were becoming, inadvertently, witnesses to the moral contrast between fascism and democracy. Plans were quietly discussed about how to use them in post-war re-education programs once they were repatriated to Germany. At the same time, German propaganda efforts struggled to maintain credibility. Berlin radio continued to broadcast stories of Allied atrocities, warning troops that surrender meant starvation and humiliation. But the truth had already crossed the Atlantic, carried in the guarded letters of POWs who described their treatment with disbelief. Censors allowed only limited correspondence, but even a few lines were enough. "We are well. Do not worry. The Americans are not what we were told." Such sentences, smuggled through war's bureaucracy, did what no weapon could. They eroded the foundation of fear. The impact extended beyond psychology. The humane system also ensured stability. With hundreds of thousands of prisoners scattered across a vast nation, violence or rebellion could have turned catastrophic. Yet serious disturbances were rare. Guards reported that most prisoners obeyed orders willingly, some even volunteering for extra work. To the Americans, this confirmed what they already suspected. Discipline built through fairness was more sustainable than that built through terror. From a leadership perspective, the POW program became a model of wartime administration. Inspections by the International Committee of the Red Cross consistently praised American compliance, while reports from German officers, even those loyal to the Reich, admitted grudging respect. One major captured in Tunisia wrote in his diary, later recovered after the war, "We expected the enemy to break us. Instead, they are teaching us how to remain men." The moral contrast was so sharp that it unnerved some American commanders. They worried that excessive leniency might appear unpatriotic to grieving families at home. But High Command refused to waver. For every newspaper that demanded harsher treatment, there was an officer reminding the nation that America fought to preserve its principles, not abandon them. The quiet brilliance of the system lay in its restraint. Every bowl of soup, every clean bunk, every fair inspection served a purpose beyond comfort. It told a story. And that story was spreading, word by word, across oceans and through minds. By the time the war's final months arrived, the Americans realized that their greatest weapon against totalitarianism was not the bomb or the tank. It was the undeniable proof that decency could prevail even amid destruction. The German prisoners, who had once believed strength was measured by cruelty, were now living inside a different lesson. That moral power could conquer without firing a shot. By the spring of 1944, the rhythm of life inside the American POW camps had become strangely predictable. Reveille sounded at dawn. The prisoners lined up in the open air, the smell of damp earth and coffee rising from the mess halls. Flags were raised, roll calls taken, and the day began. Quietly, efficiently, without cruelty. Yet beneath that calm routine, something was shifting. The first sign appeared in the way the men looked at the guards. When they had arrived months earlier, many had stood stiff-backed, eyes cold, lips tight with defiance. Now, those same faces softened into curiosity. A sergeant who once glared at every order now nodded in acknowledgement. The transformation wasn't sudden, it was cumulative. The slow erosion of fear through countless small acts of decency. Every morning, they watched the American cooks prepare breakfast. Oatmeal, eggs, bread. When the meal bell rang, they were served before the guards, every day, without exception. To the prisoners, this was more than a meal. It was a mirror held to everything they had been told about the enemy. Why do they do this? One soldier asked his comrade at Camp Atterbury, Indiana. The man shrugged. Because they can afford to. But as the weeks turned into months, the answer changed. They began to see it not as arrogance, but as something else. Discipline, dignity, and the quiet assertion of moral control. In official reports, American officers noticed it too. A 1944 inspection at Camp Swift recorded that the morale of prisoners remains high. Cooperation with guards is excellent. There is evident appreciation of fair treatment. The U.S. Army's adherence to rules was deliberate to the point of ceremony. Every inspection was public. Every punishment followed due process. The prisoners learned that appeals could be made, that medical attention was a right, and that even in confinement, they existed within a framework of law. One German officer, a lieutenant from the Africa Corps, later described his astonishment. "I requested better shoes, and the next day, they were issued. I thought it was a test, but it was simply regulation. That was the test." For men raised in a state where fear replaced justice, this was disorienting. The War Department's prisoner of war branch kept meticulous records of these reactions. Reports noted a recurring theme: disbelief. Prisoners found it difficult to reconcile such humane treatment with the total destruction they knew was being inflicted on Germany from the air. How could the same nation that burned Hamburg also treat its captured soldiers with respect? The contradiction gnawed at them. Some began to argue in the barracks, late at night, as the dim lights flickered over bunks. The hardline Nazis insisted it was propaganda, that the Americans were softening them for later exploitation. Others, quietly, began to question everything they had believed. In Camp Shanks, New York, where new arrivals were processed, a German non-commissioned officer broke down during interrogation. He confessed that the treatment had broken his sense of superiority. "We were told we were the master race," he said. "But here, we are the ones being taught how to be civilized." Such confessions spread quietly, like ripples across the camp system. At Camp Concordia, guards recalled a day when the prisoners were ordered to line up for inspection. A rumor had circulated that one of the men had been caught stealing food. When the commander arrived, he spoke calmly through an interpreter. Whoever took it stepped forward. No one moved. The officer paused, then said, "Then you will all eat the same." He turned and walked away. The next morning, the missing bread reappeared in the kitchen, untouched. Moments like these became lessons in morality without words. The American officers never preached democracy. They demonstrated it through procedure and restraint. Meanwhile, the prisoners received letters from home, fragmented glimpses of a Germany collapsing under bombardment. Cities gone, families displaced, food scarce. In the camps, meanwhile, they ate well, slept safely, and watched baseball games beyond the wire. The irony was unbearable for some. Guilt settled heavily on men who realized they were living better lives as prisoners than their families endured in the Reich. One diary entry, later archived in the U.S. National Archives, reads, "We are the captives, yet we live as kings compared to those at home. How can this be justice?" The American guards noticed the shift in mood. Quieter, more introspective. Fewer salutes, fewer outbursts. Some prisoners began to write essays in English classes about freedom, honor, and conscience. The simple fairness of their captors had become an ideological pressure no propaganda could withstand. Every meal served, every rule followed, every appeal granted. All of it carried a silent message that was impossible to ignore. The enemy they had fought was not barbaric, but principled, and in that realization, a century of militaristic pride began to fracture. By mid-1944, the camps had grown into strange reflections of the world beyond the barbed wire. Fragments of Germany transplanted into the heart of America. But unlike the Reich they had left behind, these fragments began to evolve. It started with a simple order at Camp Concordia, Kansas. An American officer, Captain Douglas Porter, announced that a team of German engineers would be allowed to rebuild sections of the camp's irrigation ditch. The task required saws, axes, and spades, all potential weapons. Yet, to the astonishment of the guards, the tools were handed over without supervision. The work was done perfectly. When Porter returned that evening, the men had completed the project, stacked the tools neatly, and left a hand-painted sign in English. "Work done. Tools ready. No escape today." The gestures spread like rumor through the POW network. At other camps, similar scenes repeated themselves. In Texas, prisoners on agricultural duty were offered the chance to work on local farms. They were paid in script coupons, and some farmers even invited them to family dinners. A guard at Camp Hearn wrote in his log, "It's becoming impossible to tell who's the prisoner and who's the guest." The truth was that trust had begun to dissolve the invisible wall between captor and captive. At Camp Swift, an American sergeant named Joseph Benton described a night when a group of German musicians, former members of a Wehrmacht band, asked permission to perform. The guards agreed. That evening, as floodlights glowed over the compound, the air filled with the melancholy sound of a cello and a flute. When they finished, silence hung heavy in the air before one of the guards began to clap. Soon, the entire watchtower joined in. A prisoner later wrote in his diary, "In that moment, the war ended for a few minutes." This quiet humanization terrified Nazi hardliners within the camps. The loyalists, still devoted to the Führer, saw kindness as poison. They organized secret cells, threatened those who cooperated, and painted swastikas in barracks as a reminder of their loyalty. But even they began to lose authority as the months passed. In Camp Shanks, a group of diehards attempted to stage a hunger strike, demanding treatment-fitting German officers. The protest lasted less than a day. The younger prisoners, tired, disillusioned, and hungry, turned against them. One of them shouted across the barracks, "You want honor? Earn it. These men treat us better than our own ever did." That outburst marked a turning point. The ideological walls cracked, not from force, but from decency. The War Department's educational program, known as the Intellectual Diversion Plan, accelerated the change. Prisoners were given access to lectures, films, and reading materials about democracy, the rule of law, and the U.S. Constitution. The idea was not propaganda, it was exposure. The Americans wanted the men to see how freedom functioned, even in captivity. At Camp Concordia, a small library was built from donated books. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer became an unlikely favorite. German officers debated the story in broken English, fascinated by the idea of a boy defying authority not out of hate, but out of conscience. Meanwhile, American guards began to notice something else. The camp's discipline improved without threats. Escape attempts nearly ceased. Complaints were handled respectfully. And during roll call, men began to salute not the swastika, but the camp commander himself. For the first time, some prisoners voluntarily helped with camp administration, organizing work schedules, designing theater stages, even composing music for camp events. In one extraordinary case, a prisoner named Friedrich Lenz, a former architect from Dresden, requested permission to build a small chapel using scrap wood. When completed, both German prisoners and American guards attended its first service together. The chaplain later wrote, "There were no uniforms in that room, only men." Not everyone could accept the change. A few prisoners continued to mutter about betrayal and weakness. Yet even they could not ignore the evidence around them. The guards who carried rifles by day often played chess with the prisoners by night. And beyond the wire, the world continued to burn. Germany was collapsing. The Reich was dying. But inside the fences of rural America, something paradoxical was being born. A sense of moral clarity the prisoners had never known. Letters from home began to arrive filled with despair. Destroyed homes, missing relatives, starvation. Many POWs wept openly, unable to reconcile their comfort with their homeland's ruin. The camp psychologists noted a collective shame spreading among them. Some requested to join volunteer labor units to assist American farms or factories, simply to feel useful. A few even began teaching English to fellow prisoners, saying it was time to prepare for the world that would follow. In the spring of 1945, as Germany's defeat loomed, Captain Porter wrote in his final camp report, "They came here as soldiers of a brutal state. They will return as men who have seen that mercy can be stronger than fear." It was a simple sentence, but it captured the essence of what had unfolded across hundreds of camps. The war had begun as a contest of firepower and will. It was ending as a revelation about humanity itself. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the men behind America's fences felt both relief and dread. The loudspeakers crackled with the news. Germany had surrendered. There were no cheers, only silence. For months, rumors had filled the camps. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Families were gone. Entire cities were dust. But hearing it confirmed broke something deep inside. The empire that had promised them glory was gone. In Camp McCain, Mississippi, a prisoner named Carl Hoffman stood by the barbed wire, staring west. He whispered to a guard, "So, we lost everything." The American sergeant beside him, weary but kind, only replied, "You lost the war. Don't lose yourself." That moment repeated itself in 1,000 variations across the country. Men who had once marched beneath banners of conquest now sat quietly, folding letters, staring into the wide American sky. They began to understand what had truly defeated them. Not just superior weapons, but an idea. The idea that strength need not come from cruelty. Yet even as they reflected, new uncertainty arrived. The war was over, but most of the 370,000 German POWs in the United States could not yet go home. Europe lay in ruins, the logistics of repatriation tangled in politics and chaos. Many would remain in America until 1946, some until 1947. During that time, life in the camps subtly shifted. The barbed wire remained, but its meaning changed. Guards and prisoners worked side by side to dismantle temporary barracks, restore farmland, and maintain local supply chains. The labor program became essential to post-war recovery. In the South, farmers mourned the departure of their German boys. Newspapers recorded scenes of farewell that seemed almost impossible for a world just emerged from total war. American families baking farewell pies, prisoners shaking hands with guards who had once watched them through rifles. And in one Kansas town, A local band playing Lily Marlene as buses departed for the railhead. Letters flooded the War Department from Americans pleading for their POWs to stay. Some offered sponsorship, promising jobs or farm housing. But the Geneva Convention was clear. Prisoners must be repatriated. So the departures began. The process was systematic, yet heavy with emotion. Trains rolled eastward carrying men who had entered America as enemies and left as something else entirely. At ports like Newport News and Boston, ships waited to return them to a Europe that no longer resembled their memories. On board, the atmosphere was surreal. Men who had once crossed the Atlantic in fear of torpedoes now sailed home in safety, but with uncertainty as their only companion. Some clutched English books. Others carried small gifts, harmonicas, pocket Bibles, or photographs of American families who had treated them kindly. When they landed in France or Britain, reality struck hard. The Allied authorities processed them through re-education camps, this time to screen for Nazi loyalty. Those found unrepentant were held longer. Those who showed change were cleared for return to Germany. But Germany itself offered little to return to. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were smoldering skeletons. Families were scattered or dead. Industry lay in ruins. Many returning POWs stepped onto train platforms that no longer existed. Yet among them was a quiet resilience, born not of nationalism, but of perspective. They had seen another world. One where discipline did not mean domination, where guards shared food, and where a man's worth was not defined by rank or bloodline. Historians later noted a striking trend. Many ex-POWs who had spent time in America became among the most stable and moderate voices in post-war Germany. They resisted extremism, supported Reconstruction, and advocated cooperation with the Allies. In 1946, sociologist Arnold Kramer recorded testimonies from hundreds of returnees. One man said simply, "In America, I learned what freedom feels like when you do not own it." Another wrote, "They fed us first. I could never forget that. It was the beginning of my new life." These experiences formed an invisible current running through the rebuilding of the new Germany. When the Federal Republic was established in 1949, many of its early civic leaders, teachers, administrators, and engineers had once been POWs in America. Their exposure to democratic values, fairness, and accountability had reshaped their understanding of authority. It didn't make them American, it made them human again. By late 1946, as the last POW ships left American ports, the War Department quietly dismantled the remaining camps. Barracks were sold as lumber. Watchtowers came down. Fields were returned to farmers. Yet in hundreds of small towns, traces of that strange wartime chapter remained. German carvings on mess hall walls, letters exchanged across oceans, memories that neither side could quite explain. It had been a war of destruction, but within its ruins, something unexpected had survived. Respect. And as one camp commander wrote in his closing report, "They came to us in defeat. We sent them home in dignity." When the last prisoner ships vanished beyond the Atlantic horizon, America moved on quickly. The headlines shifted to the Nuremberg trials, the atomic age, and the emerging tension with the Soviet Union. Yet for the men who had lived behind those quiet fences in Kansas, Texas, and Georgia, the memory of captivity never faded. In Germany, the returnees found themselves in a world of ash and hunger. Their homes were gone. Their country was divided. The Nazi ideology that once consumed them was now a ghost, something no one dared defend openly. But when the returning POWs spoke of America, people listened. They told stories that defied every wartime myth, that their captors had treated them with fairness, that they had been fed, educated, and even respected. That kindness, not cruelty, had been America's most effective weapon. For a generation raised on propaganda about the monstrous enemy, these accounts sounded almost impossible. But they spread through letters, through family conversations, through small-town veterans' meetings. The influence was subtle but unmistakable. Many former POWs became advocates of moderation in post-war politics. Some entered education, teaching civics and foreign languages. Others joined Reconstruction efforts under the Marshall Plan. They saw firsthand that rebuilding required not revenge, but cooperation. In 1948, when the Berlin airlift began, countless Germans who had once been American prisoners watched with awe as cargo planes dropped food over their devastated capital. For them, it wasn't just humanitarian aid, it was proof that the same nation that had captured them now sought to feed their families. And in a strange, almost poetic symmetry, a few former POWs ended up working at American bases in West Germany, guarding gates and fixing machines, standing where their captors once stood. Some even returned to America. By the 1950s, immigration policies softened, and invitations were extended to skilled workers. Former POWs who had maintained correspondence with American families were sponsored for return. They settled in places like Wisconsin, Illinois, and Texas, the same regions where they had once been imprisoned. One man, Friedrich Lenz, the architect who had built the wooden chapel at Camp Concordia, wrote to his former commander in 1952, "I am back in Kansas now, as a free man. The fields look the same, but I walk them differently." Their stories began to attract scholarly attention. The U.S. Army Historical Division and post-war German sociologists conducted studies revealing a remarkable pattern. Exposure to fair treatment, education, and humane discipline during captivity produced more stable reintegration. Unlike the bitterness left by Soviet or British captivity, the American experience became associated with moral rehabilitation. Of course, not all memories were kind. Some POWs never escaped the guilt of survival, knowing that while they ate well in America, their families starved in bombed-out cities. Others struggled with the quiet shame of having believed in lies for so long. Yet even that guilt became transformative. Many dedicated their post-war lives to confronting totalitarianism and rebuilding civil society. In 1955, a former POW named Gerhard Weiss, once a Luftwaffe mechanic, addressed a gathering of German students in Hamburg. He said, "I learned more about freedom while wearing American cuffs than I did in 12 years of Nazi schooling." His words echoed across a generation rebuilding from ruins. By the 1960s, the story of the German POWs in America began to re-emerge in books, films, and documentaries, often portrayed not as tales of humiliation, but of awakening. Camp towns held reunions. Veterans on both sides exchanged letters and photographs. At Camp Algona, Iowa, local residents erected a small museum in honor of the POWs who had built a life-sized nativity scene during Christmas 1944. A gesture of faith that had stunned the townspeople. The display still stands today, restored each winter by volunteers. The memory had shifted from one of captivity to one of shared humanity. Historians now view this period as one of the quietest, yet most meaningful social experiments of World War II, proof that dignity can exist even within confinement. The humane treatment of prisoners under the Geneva Convention was not merely law, it became a living demonstration of democratic values. Through discipline without hatred, structure without cruelty, and authority without arrogance, the Americans achieved what armies rarely do. They turned enemies into witnesses of their own ideals. By the time West Germany joined NATO in 1955, many policymakers, officers, and educators who shaped the new democratic republic carried memories of their time in American camps. The lessons they had learned, order, fairness, individual responsibility, subtly underpinned the nation's rebirth. The war had ended in devastation, But for thousands of men once branded enemies, captivity had been the beginning of moral reconstruction. In their private letters, they rarely used the word forgiveness. They spoke, instead of understanding, of discovering that compassion could break cycles that bullets never could. And in that understanding lay the foundation of the post-war alliance that would define the second half of the 20th century. Enemies had become partners. In the great machinery of war, history often remembers the loudest moments: the thunder of artillery, the flash of invasion, the surrender signed in ink. But sometimes the truest victories are silent. On distant American fields, far from the ruined cities of Europe, that silence became a lesson. Behind barbed wire and under watchtowers, thousands of men discovered that strength could exist without cruelty, that discipline could coexist with mercy. What began as mere compliance with the Geneva Convention became something far deeper, a reflection of the very ideals the Allies claimed to defend. To feed a prisoner first, to treat an enemy with respect. These acts carried no headlines, no medals. Yet they redefined the meaning of triumph. For the German soldiers who lived through it, the experience was transformative. Many would return home haunted not by brutality, but by kindness. They had seen a nation that wielded power, yet refused to humiliate. And in that restraint, they glimpsed a form of civilization their own leaders had denied them. Historians often debate strategies, weapons, and ideologies, but the story of the German POWs in America endures for another reason. It revealed that human decency, even amid total war, can alter the course of nations. When those men rebuilt Germany, they carried with them quiet memories, the smell of bread from an American mess hall, the sound of laughter shared with a guard, the simple dignity of being seen as men rather than enemies. Those memories shaped more than lives. They shaped values. They bridged the unthinkable gap between two former adversaries and helped lay the moral groundwork for a democratic Germany, one that would rise not in defiance, but in partnership. And so, within the paradox of war, something profoundly human survived. It was not victory through conquest, but victory through compassion. Not domination, but understanding. A quiet reminder that even in humanity's darkest century, light was not extinguished. It simply burned behind fences, in the hearts of men who learned what it truly meant to be free.